have the privilege to introduce our first panelist, Zoe Davis. And I'm going to read her wonderful bio. Zoe serves on the Climate Ready Boston team at the Environment Department. As a project coordinator, she supports the development of neighborhood climate resilience planning, the integration of climate change preparedness projections into multiple municipal projects, planning and permit review, and the development of resources for residents, small businesses, and other stakeholders to take action. Previously, Zoe served as a land stewardship coordinator and Terra Corp service member with the Mystic River Watershed Association, which is a fine organization, and also one of our partners for this Climate Prep Week. There, she organized habitat restoration projects in public parks and partnered with community groups and local governments to create climate education program and forums for public discourse about coastal resilience. Zoe received a Bachelor's of Science in Biology with an environmental science concentration from Gordon Conwell. And without further ado, we'll bring Zoe to the screen. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Vernon, and thank you for inviting me on the panel. Hi, everyone. My name is Zoe Davis. As Vernon said, I'm a climate resilience program coordinator with the City of Boston's Environment Department. Today, I'm going to spend a bit of time talking a bit about Climate Ready Boston and the city's climate preparedness initiatives focusing on heat. Climate Ready Boston is an initiative to develop resilient solutions in order to prepare the city's residents, its infrastructure, and natural resources for the long-term effects of climate change. And what this looks like is assessing the vulnerabilities and identifying the necessary interventions that will reduce climate impacts over the century. In 2016, the city completed an assessment of Boston's vulnerabilities to climate impacts, and it recommended a number of initiatives that would build resilience across infrastructure and buildings and communities, especially those most vulnerable to climate risks. And Climate Ready Boston builds off of a number of other visions. You can see some of the precedents here on the screen. I'll highlight Imagine Boston 2030, which is the first citywide plan in 50 years. And this plan provided a framework to protect and enhance the city. Some of the biggest takeaways from this plan was carbon reduction and neutrality goals, as well as goals for climate resilience and planning. And a couple other initiatives to note. Resilient Boston provides a framework for social resilience and equity goals, and how these can be integrated into climate resilience. The Open Space and Recreation Plan with objectives for improving and protecting open space, and Go Boston 2030, suggesting initiatives to, or proposing initiatives to grow transportation infrastructure, considering climate adaptation and reducing emissions. So this is just to name a few. So the 2016 Climate Ready Vulnerability Assessment identified 4 main climate factors, and from these factors, identified 3 main climate hazards. And so these are what you see here: extreme temperatures, looking at extreme heat specifically, extreme precipitation, sea level rise, and coastal storms, yielding stormwater and coastal and riverine flooding. So I'm just going to focus on heat here. Urban heat risk, as many of you know, and may have experienced firsthand, extreme heat is an incredibly significant risk in the city of Boston. And according to the CDC, extreme heat causes more climate-related deaths in the city, in U.S. cities, than any other climate-related risk. And I'm sure many of you have experienced the previous summer 2019, we reached record highs in July. And this was the hottest month on record since record has been kept in 1872. And so the graph that you're looking at on the right shows the model progression of extreme heat days, where the baseline information shows the baseline information in 2015 shows that we had 22 days over 90 degrees in 2015, and we could be seeing up to 40 days over 90 degrees in 2030, and by 2070 up to 90 days over 90 degrees. And so summers are getting hotter with more heat waves, and with more heat waves and hot days, this means increased heat island exposure. And so why then does climate resilience matter, especially within the context of heat? Well, heat waves and heat island exposure does not affect people equally. Children and older adults are affected at higher rates, and those who do not have access to cool spaces in the summer, as well as individuals with conditions that are exacerbated by heat, like asthma. And heat island exposure is also greater in neighborhoods with limited green space. And so as you can see on the map on the left, areas where we have high intensity of heat, they line up with areas where there's more pervious surface and less green space. So how do we plan for heat resilience in the long term? To reduce urban heat and enhance the lives of residents, we take a layered approach with integrated systems. And so this includes identifying the solutions at the development, design, and zoning level, and integrated with solutions for helping neighborhoods, their communities, and families, protecting the urban wilds, as well as integrating all of the heat planning along with coastal resilience and stormwater resilience planning. And so I'll just name a few efforts, ongoing, past and ongoing. The city's been implementing long-term urban heat resilience through outreach, education, and engagement, through training 311 responders to respond to heat calls, as well as coordinating climate readiness education and engagement with the public health department, as well as through zoning and energy initiatives, one through the resiliency checklist and policy, which requires development projects to consider present and future climate conditions for heat, extreme precipitation, and sea level rise. Thinking about our zero net carbon goals to reduce the use of fossil fuels and increase the use of renewable energy, and the smart utilities policy, encouraging development to think about integrated systems to reduce energy load and increase resilience in buildings. And through planning with initiatives such as heat mapping, through specifically the MAPC's Climate Smart Cities tool, as well as the Museum of Science amazing work through Wicked Hot Boston project. Updating the city's heat emergency action plan, which is underway with the Office of Emergency Management and the Public Health Commission, and working closely with the Parks Department on coordinating work around growing the urban forest. And so looking to the future, what we'd like to do is, again, building on existing climate resilience work, further define heat adaptation strategies that we can be implementing that will have the greatest impact for residents at risk and reduce urban heat in the city, while also accelerating infrastructure and growth, growing healthy environment, and building resilient communities. So with that, thank you all very much, and I will pass it over to Craig.
And before Craig goes, I'd like to properly introduce him before he goes, before he shares with us his perspective. And I'm going to read to you his bio. The wonderful Craig S. Altomos is founding executive director of the Better Future Project, the home of 350 Massachusetts, Divest Ed, and particularly relevant for today's event, communities responding to extreme weather. Prior to starting the Better Future Project in 2010, Craig co-founded and led a Massachusetts student climate action network called Students for a Just and Stable Future. He holds a Juris Doctorate from Harvard Law School, a Master's in Public Policy from the John K. Kennedy School of Government, and a Bachelor's in International Relations and Global Affairs from Eckerd College in Florida. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure and an extreme honor to introduce Craig S. Altimos, and please feel free to take it away.
Thank you so much, Vernon, for that very kind introduction. I also have some slides here. And yeah, so I will be talking about CREW's Climate Resilience Hub program, which I think is particularly relevant to today's topic. So just a tiny bit about CREW. We're a young grassroots organization aiming to build equitable, inclusive neighborhood climate resilience in New England and actually soon beyond New England through hands-on education, service, and planning. And our motto is that climate resilience is social resilience, and social resilience is climate resilience. And I think when a lot of folks talk about preparing for climate change, that there's a lot of emphasis on the built infrastructure, which obviously absolutely has to be enhanced unquestionably. But I think our general thinking is that infrastructure ultimately serves people. And we really need to be making sure that the people, our population, and particularly the more vulnerable members of that population are engaged and looked after as we have these extreme weather events and other climate impacts. And you heard from Zoe that the city is happily thinking similarly, and I think increasingly folks are. But we and obviously Conservation Law Foundation, as you'll hear, is also very interested in that topic as well. But for us, that's really the key thing that we tend to focus on here at CREW. And so we have this concept of resilience hubs, which we did not create, but we've tried to create an inclusive opportunity for local community anchor institutions to engage. And so basically resilience hubs, again, from our perspective, are trusted community institutions that have a physical space that want to help their surrounding community be more prepared for and more resilient to the impacts of climate change. And so we are rolling actually 3 different types of engagement opportunities. The first and simplest, and what we'll be focusing most on today for Climate Resilience Hub, is to simply serve as an outreach, education, and engagement hub for your community in regards to climate impacts and extreme weather. The Climate Resilience Center will do that and also provide electricity, internet, or cooling during extreme weather events such as heat waves. So serving as a cooling shelter is a very obvious offering. But again, I think in our increasingly digital world and technology reliant world, providing electricity and internet can be a really important service to provide for folks during extreme weather events. And then finally, Climate Resilient Shelter, which would do the same as the previous 2, but also then have overnight sheltering capacity and backup energy supplies, and the ability to equip folks with other emergency supplies and directly connect and embed with emergency management structures of the municipality and the state government, and structures and systems. But again, for us, at the simplest level, we think it's really important to have a very inclusive definition of what can serve as a climate resilient sub. So at the moment, we just have 3 requirements for organizations to commit to. One is to display a Climate Resilience Hub window decal at a front entrance, so that as folks enter, they learn that you are a hub and can ask for more information around that. The second is to year-round make climate and emergency preparedness information available to those who enter your establishment, your house of worship, your library, your civic center, so that any day of the year someone comes in, they have the opportunity to learn more about these issues and how they can be better prepared as individuals. And then at least once a year to host an event, an educational event, a service event, a planning event related to climate preparedness. And again, so that proactive engagement into the community. And again, we're hoping that many hubs will choose to have more than one such event. But again, in interest of being very inclusive and encouraging as many folks as possible to participate, only requiring just the one. So currently we have 15 hubs confirmed in Massachusetts, which, as you'll see, are primarily libraries, thanks to a close partnership with the Mass Library System, who are also key partners for Climate Preparedness Week. And we actually have a couple already outside of the state. And thanks to a partnership with the American Library Association, we will imminently be adding 25 pilot hubs around the country as an initial step of extending this model beyond Massachusetts. But within Massachusetts, we do have a very particular goal, which is that every Massachusetts resident to be within 20 minutes, so by foot in urban areas or by car in more rural areas, of a climate resilience hub by the year 2030. So again, we think that these hubs are really, really important institutions to engage with and serve the local community, and that everyone should have access to them. And I think for Massachusetts specifically, obviously a good chunk of our population and a decent chunk of our more vulnerable residents live here within Boston. So we are really delighted to be working with the Conservation Law Foundation to help advance this goal, and to figure out how we really prioritize which portions of Boston, which neighborhoods to focus on with our initial outreach here. And I do just want to lift up that if folks are interested in becoming a hub in Boston, in Massachusetts, or outside, to please be in touch with my colleague Margaret Thurston, who is our Climate Resilience Hub Coordinator, to email her at margaret@climatecrew.org for more information, and obviously in our website. I think in the chat, folks also have an opportunity to learn more about being a hub or signing up. So thank you all so much, and with that I will turn it back over to Vernon to introduce Saritha.
Thank you so much for sharing the helpful information with our audience, and we certainly do appreciate that. So without further ado, I'll introduce Saritha Ramakrishna, who is a policy analyst at the Conservation Law Foundation, which is one of CREW's partners, and we're glad to have that partnership. She works on projects in the areas of climate resilience and transportation, often on the side of data and analysis. Her background is in urban planning, and she holds a MPC, a Master's in City Planning, from MIT School of Architect and Planning. And she originally is from Phoenix, Arizona, which is a very fine city and very wonderful city to visit if you haven't visited yet. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Saritha, and please take it away.
Thank you, Vernon, for the introduction. Like everyone else, I have some slides that I'm about to share, so let me do that. So as Vernon mentioned and was able to introduce me, my name is Saritha Ramakrishna. I am a policy analyst with Conservation Law Foundation, and I'm going to be talking about the mapping exercise we did to help supplement some of this work. So the purpose of our study and our mapping was to identify areas within the city that could benefit from the activation of one of the resilience hubs that Craig talked about. And then following, what we wanted to do was evaluate public facilities in these areas to figure out, like, are there gaps, are needs being met, and try to sort of move the work forward in that way. So I'm going to be going through our methodology, basically describing how we got to identifying the areas that would most benefit from these hubs. So we created an indicator based on 3 components: social vulnerability from the Center of Disease Control's index, which focuses on a number of different things, looking at some of those vulnerable populations that Zoe mentioned, so where there are children, where there are seniors, looking at some aspects of housing, so housing crowdedness and access to vehicles and transportation, and then looking at factors related to English proficiency, related to race and historic marginalization, and looking at low-income status of residents. And then we also looked at built environment factors. We were looking at building quality, infrastructure, and telecommunications quality as far as internet goes, and also impervious surface. And then finally, of course, climate hazards, both flooding and heat. So once we did that, we created that indicator. We basically created a list of high priority census tracts or neighborhood level geographic designations to focus on. And then what we did is we evaluated what facilities are available in those tracts and what neighborhood stability really looks like for those areas. And so here are some of our results. So this is a map of social vulnerability as described by the Center of Disease Control. And yeah, you can see the darkest areas are those that have the highest index value. So you can see in East Boston, Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan. And I think that you can think about, there are a lot of structural reasons in thinking about like how we think about climate vulnerability and climate justice. I think as we'll get into it, you can sort of also see a lot of the places that we identify are places that face historic disinvestment, previously redlined, et cetera. And then for the built environment, sort of similarly, so again, looking at building stock quality, looking at telecommunications and infrastructure quality and impervious surface, you see some similar neighborhoods scoring high in that. And then for heat, we looked at land surface temperature as a proxy for urban heat island effect. And heat is pretty concentrated in areas where there is high impervious surface. So areas kind of closer to downtown, but you can also see in Roxbury and Dorchester, there are some pockets, and it's a little bit cooler in places that are closer to a lot of green space. And we also looked at flooding. So this is all of the census tracts, or basically the geographic designations that overlap with Climate Ready Boston's 2070 floodplain for a 100-year storm. So these are the areas that would be affected. And if you're looking further out into that time horizon, you can see that areas that would be affected by flooding, and that is actually a large part of the city. Going into Roxbury, Dorchester, and of course, looking at East Boston, the entire area is affected. And so what we did is we created a composite based on these individual factors, both for heat and flooding. And you can see the areas in the darkest color here are the ones that are most vulnerable or most climate sensitive based on all of these individual factors. And similarly, flooding, you see the communities that are particularly affected by that, also considering these other factors that we included. So as a result, you get a number of high priority areas. These are the ones that are highlighted in pink. And I think as a note for folks that are engaged with data analysis or mapping efforts, I think in doing this, one thing that I just wanted to note as someone that's sort of a practitioner of this is that data and spatial analysis and mapping, it's kind of a high level exercise, and well, there's an expedience to it and being able to combine multiple factors to arrive at a conclusion. I think there's so many things happening on the ground that are very hyper-local, that are specific to the folks in the communities that are kind of living everyday lives that are not going to be captured in a mapping or spatial analysis. So I think with that to say that while we've identified these tracts, that isn't to say that there aren't other places in the city of Boston that aren't also experiencing particular sensitivity or vulnerability to climate. And I think it's the city as a whole. So just that's a note to keep in mind. But the areas that we identified as particularly climate sensitive are East Boston and Roxbury, but then we also identified a number of other neighborhoods, South Boston, North End, South End, JP, Fenway, Chinatown, and Dorchester. And so taking a closer look at this, we tried to understand and sort of break this down by neighborhood, how exactly this sort of plays out with the individual hazards. An important point to note is that for East Boston and Roxbury and South Boston, these are places that are simultaneously facing heat hazards as well as hazards related to flooding in this analysis. And another note, just in terms of the share of the population that is actually being affected by neighborhood or is identified as high priority through the spatial analysis. So if you see Chinatown, there's the entire area of Chinatown is affected or is identified as high priority. Similarly for East Boston, it's a pretty high percentage, like around 60%. And then for North End, Roxbury as well. And then we looked at facilities. So specifically, we were looking at facilities that are, for the large part, publicly owned, besides places of worship. So we were looking at community centers, libraries, and schools. And we wanted to see basically on a per square mile basis, so in terms of geographic accessibility and in terms of like the service area and the number of folks that are served by these facilities, so the number of facilities per 100,000 people, what that looked like by neighborhood. So everything that's highlighted in orange are the areas that we identified as high priority. or at least have tracts that are identified as high priority within those neighborhoods. And yeah, as you can see, it's kind of a mixed spread. Some of the neighborhoods we identified as high priority have very, seemingly good facilities coverage, whereas others don't. So Fenway, Charlestown, Longwood, and Brighton have the fewest facilities per 100,000 people. But then by geographic accessibility, you see places like Hyde Park and West Roxbury that are less dense, and East Boston have the fewest facilities per square mile. So you can see that, like, for example, if we're looking at these areas that are particularly climate sensitive, for East Boston, there's a relatively low amount of facilities, both in terms of the number, both in terms of people and in terms of geographic accessibility, whereas in some of these other areas, that's not necessarily the case. And another thing we wanted to do as part of this effort was to think about neighborhood stability. I think that for most people, who are around from Greater Boston, you know that in addition to a climate crisis, there is a housing crisis. People are paying crazy amounts in rent, and also in terms of the cost of home ownership. So it's something that I think is happening simultaneous with the climate crisis and is very much related. Neighbors are oftentimes each other's first responders, when emergencies happen, and if people aren't able to stay in their neighborhood that they've been in for years, that kind of, phrase social ties. On top of it, you can imagine that, like, if you're paying a really high share of your income for housing, it's much harder to recover from a disaster kind of in the long term. So we looked at basically housing costs and how those have changed over the last 5 years, just using Census American Community Survey data for our identified tracts of interest. So for example, in the city of Boston, as far as rental increases from 2013 to 2018, according to this data set, you saw rents increase around 20%, but in East Boston, you're seeing rents increase upwards of 45%. And sort of similarly in terms of home values, so thinking about your low-income homeowners that are maybe seniors or on a fixed income that are paying higher property taxes as a result of home values increasing and property values increasing. You see a lot of that in Roxbury, Dorchester, the areas that we identified. So I think that it's important to note that I think that simultaneous to these areas being climate sensitive in terms of their demographics, in terms of the built environment quality, and in terms of the hazards that they're facing, these are areas that are also experiencing really dramatic changes in terms of housing stock, and the ability of people to afford living in them. So some takeaways from all of this work is that we identified a number of areas in these different neighborhoods. And just to point out, East Boston and Roxbury face some of the most significant challenges in regards to floodplain, the impervious surface, building stock quality and heat, and having a high social vulnerability index. And both of them have experienced, these changes in housing costs. And as far as our evaluation of existing community institutions, those do vary by neighborhood. Fenway and East Boston have some of the biggest gaps in existing community institutions, whereas Roxbury has a relatively high number of facilities in terms of the people metric and an average number in terms of the geographic accessibility metric. And other neighborhoods lacking facilities are less socially vulnerable, at least according to this study. So we're looking at Hyde Park, West Roxbury, Brighton, some of those areas. And yeah, so those are the general findings from this analysis, and then we get into some of our recommendations. So basically, as a result of taking a look at this data and also kind of working with crew, I think I just really wanted to underscore the importance of kind of thinking about this resilience hub model and establishing them and supporting them and integrating them into potentially city plans and initiatives. So I think that another important thing is that there's a lot of uncertainty about what's happening with local and state government funding, and making sure that these institutions are prioritized in the face of any potential budget cuts just because of the economic crisis that's happening right now. I think beyond climate, these places like libraries, schools, community centers, and places of worship, they all serve really important roles in the community outside of like climate or environmental response. I think even during the COVID crisis, we saw a lot of these places become distribution centers or places that reached out to neighbors to educate people as to like what was going on when there was a lot of uncertainty. So I just think underscoring the importance of these institutions as part of this work, earmarking funding to support resilience hubs and social resilience building, and then making sure that public realm improvements happen near some of these areas, so they're pedestrian accessible and transit accessible, and encouraging community co-ownership and co-creation. And as Craig mentioned, continuing to reduce vulnerability to climate impacts outside of the scope of social resiliency, but also in the realm of physical resiliency. This is just one component of sort of largely thinking about like how the city prepares for climate change. And I think that, yeah, it's a really important one. So yeah, I think that's generally it.
Thank you so much for that presentation, for all the presentation. Thank you so much, and thank you so kindly. So we have a question here in the chat, and we'll start off with that, and then go from there. This is a question for Zoe. Are you involving Boston Public Libraries and librarians in your planning and participating in Massachusetts statewide climate and sustainability programs and project initiated by librarians? And that comes from Fred Stoss.
Hi, Fred. That's an excellent question. So Boston Public Libraries are recognized as critical community spaces, and especially within the context of heat, critical spaces for folks to cool off. And so in a sense, yes, BPL is really critical to our planning, and considering where there are community identified spaces for people to gather. And we've participated in a number of education and engagement initiatives with BPL, but I do think there's opportunity to increase coordination and partnership. I myself am not familiar with the sustainability programs, the state sustainability programs that you're pointing out, but I'd love to know more about that, because again, I do think that there is room to increase coordination here.
Thank you for that. This is a question directed at Craig. Are the hubs being used already? How is that going?
Yeah, so to be honest, we really launched this initiative in the beginning of this year, and then had the pandemic. And so a lot of our focus of the hubs was to be proactively engaging in person with the community. Honestly, we were not anticipating a global pandemic when we were launching this. So the short version is, so the hubs are officially, again, there are 15 currently active hubs in the state. But we honestly haven't done a huge amount of programming work with them yet. We've been giving, we were in touch with folks in the start of the pandemic, and there's a sense that there's obviously, I think a lot of these institutions were pretty appropriately engaged with thinking through their own plans around reopening and how they can best serve their communities in the midst of this pandemic. And so we gave folks from space have been focusing on climate preparedness week, and then starting October we'll really be refocusing on how we can best support the existing hubs and continue to expand this program. But I think, again, like just one point to build off of that is that, again, we initially set we've intentionally set the bar very low in terms of being able to opt into this program, because we think it's so critical that as many institutions as possible sign up to become climate resilient hubs, and engage their communities. And we recognize that, again, we're not just preparing for what's coming in 2020 or 2021 or 2023, but in 2028 and 2030 and 2035. And so we do expect this program and the services that these hubs are offering to expand over time. And so we think, again, letting folks in and including folks at the ground level with a pretty minimum set of expectations will enable those institutions to plan ahead and to think about proactively how they want to be relevant to the coming impacts of climate change. And I think there's also a question sent to the panelists. So again, if folks can put their questions in the Q&A feature instead of in the chat box, just so that everyone can see the questions, that would be appreciated. But I think a related one was a question about what other Massachusetts cities, not already 15 hubs, are you already working with to reach the status of becoming a hub? And just to clarify, while we very eagerly are interested in partnerships with folks like the city of Boston, and delighted to have Zoe in the call here. So we're not working specifically with cities. We're working, those are institutions that are within towns and cities. And so there are a healthy list of institutions that we are currently in touch with, and a longer list that we plan to be in touch with. But again, it's really any house of worship, any library, any community center or civic center. We're also open to even working with places like coffee shops that are that see themselves as hubs of their community, and are willing to proactively engage their community around climate resilience. So I will turn it back over to Vernon for the next question.
Thank you for that. So we have another question here. Professor James Insurligator asks, and keep the questions coming, y'all. Keep them coming, because we have time. But Professor James Insurligator asks, I believe that hubs are doing more than just providing info and shelter. They are also engaged in local community change, I believe. Can you say more about the side of the social and civic mobilization? I believe that's addressed to Craig.
Yes, thank you. I'll take that. Thank you, James. Great to see your name there. So again, I think there are. I think a lot of these hubs and local institutions are already performing functions of that more engaged social mobilization that you're talking about. I think some specific examples. There are libraries that among other things have seed banks where folks can come and get seeds to plant more, to plant local crops, which I think is a really exciting dimension of thinking about how we improve local agriculture here in the city to deal with issues of food justice and also decrease the carbon emissions connected with transporting food from great distances, and again, improving food security. I think we did certainly see in the beginning of the pandemic a lot of concerns around food availability, and I think as climate change continues to wreak havoc on our agricultural system, and with crops being inundated and flooded, and droughts and superstorms disrupting supply chains, that again, having more locally grown food is going to be increasingly important. And so again, having institutions helping their community enhance their food systems is both strategic and important. There are also a lot of houses of worship, for instance, have programs to check in on elderly members of their community who are shut-ins, and actually even some libraries have risen to take on that role as well, which again I think is absolutely that type of proactive community engagement of identifying vulnerable members of the community who would like assistance during some of these extreme weather events, and creating systems and plans to engage with those folks, check in on those folks. We also have this bit of a tangential example, but one of our crew teams that has really been leading. There's an event next week that there's leading about depaving events, which are community events where people come together and literally break up the concrete with pickaxes and crowbars and so on, and sledgehammers, and on properties where they have permission to do this, are replacing that concrete or those paved surfaces with surfaces that you can turn more green, which both reduce the urban heat island effect and allow for better absorption of floodwaters and of intense precipitation. And so again, that's like a very I think community engaging event that educates folks while making specific improvements to the local infrastructure on kind of a micro level, but aggregated in larger numbers can make a significant difference in again both urban heat island impacts and with flooding. So definitely I think there are a lot of great examples, and we expect that those to increase as the program builds and continues. And we're certainly welcome if Zoe is aware of other great work happening in the city specifically.
Hi, sorry, I had some trouble undoing my volume there. So just with respect to heat resilience and some of the other great work that's going on, I also want to touch on one of the questions that was asked in the Q&A, specifically around urban forestry, and so how that sort of applies to some of the work that's going on here. I'll just add that the urban forest is one of the city's great assets with respect to not just heat resilience, but flood resilience as well. And so that is among some of the interventions that we've been thinking about over the past few months, and so acting on. And so my department has been working really closely with the Parks Department on how that exactly would be built out, thinking about the health of the urban canopy and how community engagement and the discourse around how communities feel about trees and the urban forest is sort of critical to building out a program like that, and not just building climate resilience, but also social resilience and resilience in community. So yeah, with that respect and how that ties in, I'm sort of thinking about the intersection of urban forestry and building community resilience of some of the work that is going on in Boston.
Thank you for that. This is a question for Sarithia. Someone said, Saritha, sorry. The question is, are you providing your analysis to other hubs beyond Boston, and are you willing to offer it to future MA hubs?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, so we chose Boston because just as a city, it has, in terms of for analysis like this, it has like a pretty high data availability. So that was the original scope of the analysis. I think it's a good question in terms of, where analysis like this goes next. I think when we originally talked about this project and we're in the sort of ideation phase with Craig and crew, I think geographic scope was a big question since there are hubs that are obviously outside of the city of Boston. So I think it might be something to think about going forward. But yeah, I think the original scope of this was within the city, specifically because it was sort of easy to kind of pull together all the information, whereas in other jurisdictions, it's a little bit tougher, so.
Thank you for that. This is another question we have for Zoe and others. Are you inviting librarians to the tables where policy and decision making are taking place? We are stewards of the largest information infrastructure and have a broad range of expertise that is rarely tapped.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that's an excellent point to bring up. What I'll say to that is there's definitely room to improve that collaboration. And I do agree that, BPL is an incredible asset, both the physical buildings, but the people that run the programs and essentially make BPL happen. I'll say that collaboration across sectors and interests is incredibly important because climate resilience, it doesn't just affect the environment. It takes a number of disciplines. And so while I think that hasn't gone, there hasn't been as much collaboration with BPL, I do think that there's certainly room for more of that. I'm happy to hear from folks on the panel regarding that, but I do agree there's definitely room for more collaboration there.
Thank you so much. Unless there's any other thoughts, we have time for one, maybe two more questions. Um, uh, Here's a question from Carol. What have crews and the city of Boston learned from supporting vulnerable populations during COVID? What from our COVID experience do you see supporting climate resiliency work going forward?
You want to start with that, Zoe, or you want me to lead on that?
Sure, I can start with that. That's an excellent question. So what we've taken from our experience with COVID is that some of the same sort of channels of communication and the same sort of webs of building resilience have been tapped into to respond to the COVID health crisis, and that and so we're seeing sort of a connection there. Those same webs of communication and resilience could be those the very same ones that we would see responding to sort of a climate crisis. And so sort of taking that into consideration, we've been looking at, what are those points of communication? Who are the folks that are most impacted, and who are the people that are servicing those people, and building relationships and connections there so that when climate crises hit, let's say the few heat waves that we experienced this past summer, we can sort of tap into those connections and get residents the services that they need. So I think it's just been about observing the situation and understanding that there are very clear synergies between what's been happening with the COVID health crisis and the climate crisis, and that because of that overlap, we can better prepare for the future.
And yeah, I'll just add it. I think one big lesson for me, at least, from this pandemic, again, has been just how interconnected so many of these issues are. That I think, a lot of people were surprised to see how much of an impact COVID had on people of color, on Black and Indigenous and people of color communities across the country, and just how really important it is to focus on social vulnerabilities and understanding and appreciating those differences. There's a very I remember, I think here in Boston, as many folks were really worried about having access to ventilators and ICU units. There's a very intentional, let's have a colorblind policy to who gets these, that if you have a pre-existing condition that makes you less likely to survive, we will deprioritize you for those units. But it turns out that deprioritizing people who have pre-existing conditions is not a colorblind policy, because Black and Indigenous and other people of color in our community are more likely to have pre-existing conditions because of things like environmental racism and environmental, the pollution that is disproportionately put upon those communities means that they are more likely to have those pre-existing conditions. And so it's not sufficient to say that we are having a race-neutral policy. We have to be really thoughtfully and intentionally anti-racist as we are designing policies and thinking through these systems. And I do think for me also, I'll just say that the pandemic is also, I think, a practice session and a warning sign for future pandemics that are likely to be exacerbated or explicitly caused by climate change. Scientists have been alerting us that as we have, the thawing of the tundra and other places that have been frozen for tens of thousands of years, that thawing, I just saw there's a cave bear that's nose is still intact that just thawed recently. There's bacteria that is in the ice that has been away from humans for tens of thousands of years, if not longer, that is being thawed and re-released into the modern world. And so I think as humans engage the bacteria as we can continue to encroach on natural places that humans have not previously lived, we should expect there to be future pandemics. And so I think being really thoughtful about how we engage from a climate resilience perspective, then thinking through what does it look like to have a cooling shelter during a time of pandemic, I think it is actually not just a present question, but also a future question. The pandemics, may have different levels of fatality, different levels of infectiousness, but we should expect this will not be the last one for us, and to start planning our climate resilient systems to have that eventuality in mind.
Thank you so much for sharing, Craig. We're winding down to the last minute, and I wanted to know if there are any final thoughts that the panelists would like to share with the audience before we reach a conclusion.
Yeah, I guess I'll just a couple of closing thoughts. One is, so there was a question about whether or not these slides will be shared, and so yeah, this is being recorded, and at the end of Climate Prep Week, we will share the recordings from all of our featured events on our website, on our YouTube page. I think the Mass Library System will do the same. And yeah, again, I'll just echo my earlier comments, that we're really eager to work with folks. So if you are connected to an existing trusted anchor community institution that would like to be a climate resilient sub, please do reach out to us, and we can talk you through walking that institution through the steps of becoming a hub. But yeah, I mean, again, I think climate change, is here. It is going to get worse, and it's going to affect all of us, but it's going to affect some of us more than others. And so just really encourage folks, obviously there's a lot that we need to do to try to make climate change less bad, and we need to keep focused on that as well, because there are different levels of bad that we could be facing. But regardless of what we do, these impacts, again, are here and are going to get worse. And so really being thoughtful about how we engage our communities and leverage the existing assets like libraries, like houses of worship, like civic centers that are already so connected to their communities, that play such a critical role already. How do we support them and enable them to be more proactive with a climate resilience lens specifically? I think it is a big part of our charge moving forward.
Yeah, I'll just say thanks so much for putting this together and having this conversation. I'll just echo some things that Craig said. I think it's totally right. It's about lifting up communities and the work that's already being done, and moving forward in a spirit of collaboration, because it does take everyone. So.
Yeah, thank you all for attending and for hearing about all of this. And yeah, just wanted to emphasize the importance of, it's a big, really insane problem, I think, when we think about climate change. But yeah, keeping it people focused and focused on communities, I think the work that Crew is doing and all of that, I think is really critical to that perspective and that sensibility.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for panelists. Thank you so much for taking the time to share with us the research and engage with us on a grassroots, what organizations are doing on a grassroots level, what the city government is doing, and what the Law Foundation is doing. And we thank you so much. And audience, we thank you for joining. Again, you could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we're just so elephant happy about it. And we hope that you have extracted a lot of useful and valuable information moving forward. And again, at Crew, we would love to talk with you. Information is already in the chat. And we wish you all have a wonderful day. Stay smooth and stay cool in times like these, and have a wonderful weekend. And thank you so much. And again, this recording will be available after Climate Prep Week on our website, along with the other central events. And again, thank you so much, and take care. And we'll see you soon.